when we're looking at the brain, this right here is the superior portion. This is the anterior, and this is the posterior. Okay, so what we have are first your meninges. All right, so you have three meninges. One is the dura, the outermost, thickest layer. The second is the arachnoid matter, that is the middle layer. And the last layer is the pia mater, which is semi-permeable, thinnest, directly on the brain, the cerebrum. Okay, so what I have here on my brain is a very thick skin. Okay, I can kind of wiggle that around, right? All of this cloudy material that I have, that is your dura mater. Okay, it's a very thick outer layer of skin. Okay, now there's a lot of yellow going on this brain, so I do want to point that out first before we actually get into the specifics of it all. So over here on the anterior side, you have very, very anterior, you have these structures right here. Okay, so these are actually what your sinuses look like. Okay, so what these are attached to on the inferior side of the brain, this is the underside, these are attached to what we call the olfactory bulbs. Okay, at this point you should have already gone over the cranial nerves, so you should know that cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. Okay, and it's responsible for smell. So it's attached to sinuses. Now also you have these large yellow fat deposits right here. They're kind of on either side of the sinuses, which makes sense because these are your eye sockets. Okay, this is what connects the actual eyeball to your optic nerves, which are these guys right here and right here. Okay, so those optic nerves come in and connect to the optic tract. Okay, so these are your eye sockets. Obviously the eyes are not here, but if you think about where your sinuses hurt when you have a sinus infection, it's right in between your eyes. So that's exactly what you have here, the sinuses right in between your eyes. Okay, okay, so now I'm going to kind of dig into the brain a little bit. Okay, I'm going to take the dura mater off. Actually, I think scissors would be best. Okay. I'm just opening this up so that we can see the inside. It's a very protective casing, very efficient. So I believe your brains should have the same dura mater on. It may not have the sinuses or the eye sockets or anything, but you should take the time to remove any dura mater that you do have. Okay. So I'm just going to be snipping the sinuses off. Okay. Trying to leave as much of the olfactory bulbs as I can so that we can still see what those look like. Good. Also snipping the eye socket off, trying to leave as much of the optic tract as I can. Very tricky back here. Careful not to cut or damage the cerebrum at this point. It's very fragile. Okay. Ta-da. Hopefully none of you just ate. That would be unpleasant. maybe it'd be best if y'all did this outside. I don't know. I've never done a dissection at home before. Okay, so I could not leave any of the optic nerves, so that's okay. Goes all the way back. It's wild. So I am trying to leave a structure right here on the underside. It's barely attached anymore, but that's okay. So that structure is the pituitary gland, okay? So if you'll notice, we have now crossed over to the underside. We are on the underside of the brain right now. This is inferior, okay? So the pituitary gland is this very large bulge on the undermost portion, and you can see the dura mater was surrounding all of it. The dura mater was basically what was holding it onto the brain, so I removed the dura mater and I kind of snipped a little bit too much and it pretty much fell off, but there's still a connection right there. But so that pituitary gland is the most inferior portion of the brain and is not actually in the brain. Look at that. Excellent. Clean. Okay, great. So this is a nice clean brain. We have the pituitary gland. We still have a little bit of the olfactory bulbs kind of hanging off here. I tried to not compromise those as much. And then a little bit here of the optic chiasm and the optic tract, which have gone to the optic nerves, okay? There are a bunch of other, if I had maybe taken my time a little bit more, I could have salvaged some more of the nerves. I did notice that I was cutting through a few, but that's okay because I really don't want you to actually identify the nerves, the cranial nerves, on anything other than the diagram that I had in the video, okay? Okay. So I am going to, okay, so we can see how the pituitary gland kind of hangs off, right? So it's not in the brain, it's on the most underside. This is inferior, this is superior. It's on the most underside of the brain, okay? Very important. So I'm actually going to take it off now because it's in the way, okay? Sorry, pituitary gland, because there is another gland that we're going to go over, but the pituitary gland is on the undermost side of the brain. Okay, so all of that aside, we have a brain, right? And now you should already know the different parts of the brain. You have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the diencephalon. Diencephalon is viewed from the internal portion only, and we'll get into that in a moment. Now, of the cerebrum, you have different lobes, right? So you have the frontal lobe, which was the anterior portion. You have the parietal lobes, the occipital lobes, and the temporal lobes. And there's also an insulus, but that's really pointless, okay? Okay, so frontal is basically your personality, all of your emotions. Temporal is your speech. A sensory is held, like your vision is held over here in the occipital, and then the parietals are pretty much known for your like balance and movement, okay? Okay. Then you have the cerebellum, this little bulge in the most posterior position, sitting on top of the brainstem, okay? Everything after the cerebellum is the spinal cord, so we don't really need to worry about this little tail, okay? Okay, so, oh, we also have hemispheres, right? So this is your left hemisphere and this is your right hemisphere. And it is kind of connected or divided by a very long slit, okay? And that slit is called the longitudinal fissure. Now, fissures are really deep slits, okay? But there's also sulci. And sulci are those little divots that you see all throughout the brain that kind of give it that nice texture. Anywhere that dark line is, okay, that's a sulcus, okay? And then the bumped up portions of brain on either side of the sulci are called gyruses. Gyrus. Yes. Okay. So you have a fissure, you have sulcus, and then you have gyrus. I think I go over the actual specifics, ones that you need to know in a different video, but that's what it looks like on a real brain. Okay, so let's just get in there. Okay, so I'm taking my scalpel and I'm going to just cut right along the longitudinal fissure. Okay, as gently and evenly as I can. I try not to go too deep. At first, and then kind of work my way up. And then once I have a solid line, I'll come back into the cerebellum. Now it's very important that you take your time with this initial cut, because there's structures that if you don't hit it straight on, then you will either put it all onto one side, one hemisphere, or the other hemisphere. So we want to make sure that we're being as careful as possible to cut all of the structures evenly to make sure that they're seen on both hemispheres. So if you have tweezers, you can kind of use that to separate the brain until you're all the way at the bottom. Okay, so that is a cut. And I actually did forget to go over something. I just realized. The meninges, there was a dura mater, arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. So obviously we could see the dura mater, it's very clear. The pia mater, however, is not as clear because it's a semi-permeable and it's right on the brain, okay? However, as I was cutting at the very bottom, I realized that I was cutting through a very kind of tough section, okay? And I left it intact right here. So this portion right here, you can see it on the spinal cord portion of the brain. It's okay, it's still pia mater, okay? So it's just a very thin, semi-permeable meninge layer. You can also kind of go like can't. There we go. Like that. See my needles? You can see my needle, right? But it's definitely stuck in there by something. That's your pia mater. Okay. Moving on to the internal structures. All right. So I'm going to just first take a look at my sections and see which one is the best for demonstration. So I'm going to go with this side. Okay. All right. We're just going to put him over there for a second. And we're just going to focus on this. Okay. Oops, one more cut. Some pia matter in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. I just want to have full access of everything. Okay. Okay. Excellent. So here we are. This is the inside of a brain, so you can now see the diencephalon, which is right here. Okay. Now, everything that I'm going to go over is just like a nice little pathway. All right. It kind of all flows into one another. Okay. So I'm going to start with this white track right here, okay? I'm moving from anterior to posterior. And this right here is the corpus callosum, okay? Now this white track is actually it's a bunch of nerves that connect the hemispheres and make them actually talk to each other, okay? So this right here is the corpus callosum. And then the corpus callosum drops inferiorly into what we call the fornix. Okay, in between the corpus callosum and the fornix, there is a cavity. Okay, you can kind of see that. All right, so this cavity is called the lateral ventricle. There's two lateral ventricles. They are connected by a lateral foramen, or a ventricle foramen, and watch the ventricle video to get the gist on those ventricles, okay? So, corpus callosum into the fornix and lateral ventricle in between, okay? Now, the fornix drops right into what we call the hypothalamus, okay? Hypothalamus moves posteriorly into, see this circle here? This is the thalamus. So you have the hypothalamus because it's before hypothalamus, thalamus, and then, hopefully you can see it right here, there's this little tiny, even more posterior, that is your epithalamus, okay? But a little bit posterior to that, you have this structure, and I can actually take this structure out of its little pocket because that is a gland, okay? This is the pineal gland, all right? So the one on the undermost outside of the brain, that was the pituitary gland, this is your pineal gland. So you have corpus callosum to the fornix, to the hypothalamus, back to the thalamus, back to the epithalamus, and back to the pineal gland. All right? Now, even more posterior, you see I broke the cerebellum away from the cerebrum. So the most posterior portions of the cerebrum are called the superior and inferior colliculi, okay? Now, they're seen better from this view here. If I kind of just move the cerebellum down like that, okay? So this, okay. Damn, pia matter. Okay, this right here is your superior colliculus, and then right under it, it's a little bit smaller. Okay, that's your inferior colliculus, all right? So this bulge right here and this lower bulge are your colliculi, superior and inferior, all right? So one more time. You have the corpus callosum into the fornix. Lateral ventricle is in between the two. Fornix drops into the hypothalamus. You move posterior into the thalamus. Posterior and superior is the epithalamus. Then you have the pineal gland. Then the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Okay? Now we're going to go to the underside of the brain one more time. All right? So you have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is not under the brain, okay? It's just lower. But actually, on the outside of the brain, right? So we had that olfactory bulb, and then you had the optic tract. Well, actually, this right here is the optic chiasm, okay? This little white portion that I can kind of play around with on the very bottom of the brain, this is the optic chiasm. That is where the two optic tracts of the optic nerves connect and then split, okay? So right here is the optic chiasm. And then moving posteriorly from that guy, you still, on the underside of the brain, you have this little white bulge right here. That's your mammillary body. Okay? So, optic chiasm, mammillary body, and then next up is to go over the brain stem. Okay? So you have midbrain, because it's kind of like in the middle of the whole thing. Midbrain. And then, anytime you see a bulge in the brainstem, that is going to be your pons. Okay? So everything from the bulge is your pons. And then everything directly under the cerebellum is the medulla oblongata. So you can see the bulge stops right here, and then the cerebellum stops right here. So all of this is the medulla oblongata. Okay? This is the spinal cord, and we don't care about it yet. Okay. Medulla oblongata, bulge is the pons, and then you have the midbrain. Mammillary body, optic chiasm. And that's kind of everything that's going on underside. Okay? So we had the lateral ventricle, and if you watch the ventricle video going over the ventricle model, you'll know that there's also a third ventricle, but we can't see it from a sagittal view. You can only see it from that model. But there's also a fourth ventricle, okay? Now the fourth ventricle is between the cerebellum and the brainstem, and it's this opening right here. This is your fourth ventricle. Okay, to get to the fourth ventricle, you have to go down what's called the cerebral aqueduct. Hopefully you remember this word aqueduct from your learnings of the ancient Rome Empire, where they used aqueduct systems. It was like the first plumbing, whatever. Anyways, so the cerebral aqueduct comes down along the superior portion of the brainstem and still in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And it comes down and it's just like bam into the fourth ventricle. Okay, so this is the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. The lateral ventricle is in between the corpus callosum and the fornix. Third ventricle, not seen from this view. Okay? Okay. Now, in the cerebellum itself, all right, you'll notice that there's white matter on the inside portion of this, kind of like how there's whiter matter on the inside portion of the cerebrum, okay? That's because for the brain, gray matter is on the outside and white matter is on the inside, all right? Now, for the white matter on the inside of the cerebellum, the white matter is actually called arbor vitae, okay? Because it kind of branches. It has all of these like branch-like structures. So it's resembling a tree. So arbor, tree. Vitae means life. So it's the tree of life, okay? So arbor vitae is found, that's the white matter in the cerebellum, all right? The gray matter doesn't really have a name. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much it. You have arbor vitae, and then in between the brainstem and the cerebellum, you have the fourth ventricle. In between the cerebrum and the brainstem, you have the cerebral aqueduct, right? Corpus callosum to the fornix, drops into the hypothalamus, move posteriorly to the thalamus. Posterior and up is the epithalamus. Then you have the pineal gland. Then you have the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi, better seen from this view, where they are nice bulges, superior colliculi and inferior colliculi, right? You have the optic chiasm, mammillary body, midbrain. Here's the pons with the bulge, and directly under the cerebellum is the medulla oblongata, all right? On the most underside of the brain, you had that pituitary gland, so that guy would be hanging out right here, okay? So that's pretty much everything going on, guys. That's a sheep brain, that's your brain, that's how it all works.